Hi all, welcome to Citrix Converge 2020. My name is Stapelbroek. I'm a solution architect and Citrix technology advocate, and I work for Cegeka within the Netherlands. We're going to talk about MultiCloud Strategies need Citrix SD-WAN, and with me is my colleague Ruud. Hi Ruud.
Hi all, my name is Ruud Hund. I'm a senior networking architect at Cegeka Netherlands.
Well, in this session, we are going to talk about getting to the cloud. We're doing a demonstration about setting up Citrix SD-WAN in Azure and in Google Cloud. We're going to talk about leveraging cloud, and at the end, this is why we do this, what's in it for my users, how do they benefit. So, getting to the cloud. We have some traditional ways about accessing clouds, and first off, that could be a direct internet link to Azure, AWS, or Google Cloud. And in the case of a more secure connection, we could add a virtual private network. And most of the times that will be a site-to-site connection or a point-to-site connection. And the last traditional way could be a dedicated private link. And that dedicated private link, in contrary to your virtual private network, isn't encrypted. So, if we have a dedicated private link or virtual private network towards our cloud resource, that isn't great, but it isn't terrible. It should be sufficient for most use cases. But if we have a multiple branch environment where all the branches have to back all their traffic to our main office towards cloud resources, it gets tricky. And in general, the challenges we have is an overtime degradation. There is no real flexibility. Like we mentioned, all branch offices have to backhaul their traffic. So things like round trip time won't benefit from this. We have no real traffic insight, and it is a legacy architecture. For the virtual private network, some benefits. It's quick to set up. There is encrypted traffic. There isn't quality of service available. It requires some manual configuration, but at the end, it is a cheap solution, and we're doing this for a long time. And next up, the dedicated links. It has a long delivery time, so if you request a dedicated link, that could cost you a few months. There is no encryption on the line. In the case of Azure ExpressRoute, there is some quality of service, but it's only on Skype and on Teams, and it is an expensive connection.
So let's see how we can connect with all the different cloud providers with Citrix SD-WAN. Now, Citrix SD-WAN provides us with two ways for connecting to the cloud. First off, which is only available with the Azure cloud, is that we can leverage Azure Virtual WAN to automatically deploy and create VPN tunnels to our Citrix SD-WAN appliances that we are running on our different sites and branches. So by doing so, we can take away all the manual labor that is required for setting up VPNs per site. And with Citrix SD-WAN and Azure Virtual WAN, we can completely automate that deployment. Now, it is encrypting the traffic, but we don't get control over the traffic flowing from our branches into Azure. For that, if we want to have complete visibility and control, we can also deploy Citrix SD-WAN VP access in all the different cloud providers. And what this does is that we can bundle multiple internet connections at our sites and branches to provide redundancy against dropouts or brownouts or complete loss of signal. And we can create a virtual path to the different Citrix SD-WAN VPX appliances in the cloud. And we can apply a full quality of service stack so that we can decide maybe a certain application has to have a higher priority compared to a different one. So we get really granular control. And also we get the option to either create a virtual path between our clouds, or maybe do it in a more dynamical way that if you have spread out resources across the multiple clouds, that the virtual path is only being created the moment that traffic is flowing from one cloud to a different cloud. So by this way, we get a really flexible and really rigid solution for connecting to our different cloud providers. Now, it's really easy to set up, also really quick. We'll show you that later on in a demonstration where we are deploying it in Azure and Google Cloud. We can apply our full quality of service stack. So we get really granular control over all the traffic. And by default, we are encrypting all the traffic. So even if you have maybe an application that's not using any secure protocol, with Citrix SD-WAN, it encrypts all the traffic, so we don't need to worry about it anymore. And if you have a multiple sites or branches, we can give every branch and site direct access to our cloud resources. So we don't have any need to backhaul any traffic anymore. And we can also implement a complete security stack per site or branch. So with the standard edition of Citrix SD-WAN, we already get a stateful firewall. But if we go for the Citrix SD-WAN Advanced Edition, we get more security control. So we can do IDS, IPS, scanning of traffic, or we can either also use a third-party security provider like Palo Alto. Now, and lastly, if we don't want to spin up any Citrix SD-WAN VPXs within the cloud, we still have the benefit that we can automate our VPN deployments with Azure Virtual WAN, saving us a lot of labor and pain in configuring all the different parameters. So let's go and start building our POC environment. Now, what we are going to build is, on the left, we have our POC local data center. And through the internet, we are going to connect our resources which reside within Azure and in Google Cloud, as you can see. And last but not least, we'll also let Google Cloud and Azure talk directly to each other. So this is high over what we are going to do. On the left, we have our Citrix SD-WAN, which we are going to deploy in the EU West region. And on the right, we have our resources within the EU North region. The resources in EU North have already been created, so we don't need to worry about that anymore. But for the rest, we are going to configure everything. And for Google, we are also deploying one Citrix SD-WAN in EU West 4. And on the right, you see we have our resources deployed in EU West 2. And on the right side, it has already been created. So also the left side, we are going to build that. So that overall, this is how it's going to look like after we are finished.
So Ruud, thanks for the overview. As you have noticed, we're using two tenants that, in our case, that doesn't only allow us to serve the Azure backbone, but it also is a limiting factor of our free trial in Azure. And that's limiting our virtual resources. So if we're going to configure it in Azure, first off, do mind, you need a new resource group, an empty resource group, otherwise you can't deploy Citrix SD-WAN. So we're going to add a new resource group, name it, and place it in the right region. That will be Western Europe. So I'm going to review and create. After the validation is passed, we're going to the marketplace and look for the Citrix SD-WAN Standard Edition. Here it is. It's the 11.0. It's a bit old, but that doesn't matter. We'll update it anyway with Citrix Cloud. So in the right region, Western Europe, general settings. I'm going to give it a name. And do mind the username. You won't be using this username again. The password, you will need it again because it's always also the standard user account password. So I'm going to define some networking. We're not going to use a default networking that Azure suggested. We're going to use our own VNet with our own address range. And within that virtual network, going to define some subnets, management, LAN, WAN, and auxiliary. And the auxiliary is mandatory, but we won't be needing it because we won't deploying a high available solution in Azure. So the last two subnets. And as stated, auxiliary is mandatory, but we won't be needing it. Click OK. Going to define a new route table in the Western Europe with the address prefix, and that is our POC environment in Groningen. So after it's I'm going to click create. So it's deploying. And after the deployment, it's almost ready. We are going to the SD-WAN and have a look at its new networking capabilities. So first off, we're going to see the management interface. Please write it down because in this way you can access the SD-WAN and get its serial number to deploy it later on in Citrix Citrix Cloud. We've got a LAN interface with this NIC and WAN. And this WAN IP, you'll be needing it if you are deploying it in as a master control node, as the master of all SD-WANs. But in our case, our master is in Groningen. Now, next up to the route table, we are going to associate the LAN subnet with the previously defined routing table. So subnet LAN. So it knows its route towards our data center in Groningen. And it's saved. Mind, this is in the Western Europe. Next up, we are going to the virtual interface. Now we're going to add some peering. So in this way, we North and West Europe can reach each other. So this is the name of the peering. Now we're going to select the VNet, the virtual network of the North tenant. I'm going to give it a name. And mind this last step. Allow forward traffic from VNet SD-WAN to VNet 10.200.1.0 because this allows non-originated traffic, non-Azure originated traffic flow through our Western region to North and vice versa. So if we won't enable this setting, our data center in Groningen cannot reach the North tenant in Azure. So we'll enable that setting. And we're going to click OK. And after it's done on both sides. So that's the nice thing of Azure. If you add a peering, it's added in both tenants. So on both VNets. So we're going to the northern region. Going to add a routing table because this doesn't exist in our northern region. I'm going to place it in the right region. North Europe. I'm going to give it a name. After that, after it's created, we're going to define a route. it's deployed. We're going to the routing table. We are going to add a route towards our data center in Groningen. Click add, give it a name, give it an address prefix, and that is the prefix of our data center in Groningen. And we're going to select the next hop type. And do notice we've got a virtual appliance here, and we're going to give it the IP address of the NIC in the LAN subnet of our Western Europe, the 1.20. And if you noticed, you saw this IP earlier. And one of the final steps is associate a subnet with a previously defined route. So our VNet and our subnet where our machine resides can reach our data center in Groningen through the Western Europe tenant.
So now that we have deployed our Citrix SD-WAN VPX in Azure, we are now going to deploy one in the Google Cloud. And we are going to start off by creating a VPC network. Now, VPC network is the same as a VNet in Azure, but for Citrix SD-WAN deployments in Google, we will need to create a VPC network per interface. So we'll start off by creating our management VPC, deploying it in the Europe West 4 region and assigning it an IP address range. And we are going to create it. Next, we are going to create one for our LAN interface. Giving the subnet a name, the deployment region, and again an IP address range. And finally, we are going to create a VPC for our WAN interface. And it's important to note that the regions have to match your deployment of the Citrix SD-WAN, so they have to be in the same region. So now that is done, we can go to the marketplace and select our Citrix SD-WAN. There it is. And we are launching the template. And it will automatically create an instance name. And it will assign the vCPUs and the amount of memory. Now, the zone and the region have to match our previously created VPCs. Now, number one interface will always be your management. The second always has to be your LAN. And make sure that you enable the checkbox to use it. And the third one is always our WAN. This order is mandatory. You cannot change it. So it's going to be deployed, and within our deployment properties, you will also see the admin user that it has created and also the password. And that password you will need later on to log in locally on the Citrix SD-WAN VPX to retrieve the serial number. So the instance has been created. So let's go to our instance now, because we need to retrieve some information. There it is. So we see that it has an external IP address for the SD-WAN management, but we're missing an external IP for our SD-WAN WAN interface. So first off, we are going to note this IP address down, as we need that to log into the management, and we are going to edit our SD-WAN WAN interface because we need a public IP. Now we can choose two options. Either we let Google decide which dynamic public IP we are getting, or we can create our own fixed public IP. Will you be deploying this instance as a master control node, an MCN, you will need to create a fixed public IP. In our case, as it's a branch, we can just use a dynamically assigned public IP address. So let's select dynamic, say done, and we are going to apply the changes to our VPX. So if all went well, we should be able to see the two public IPs. There they are. So that's that. Next, we are going to create some firewall rules. First off, we need to allow access from the internet onto the management interface. Otherwise, you won't be able to retrieve the serial number. So we're going to select the management network and allow ingress traffic. And we are going to say that the source is the internet. And we are going to allow port 443, which is used by HTTPS. And secondly, we are going to create a firewall rule that will allow a virtual path to be established between the different Citrix SD-WAN VPXs and appliances. So we are going to select our WAN network, ingress traffic, and we are going to say that the source is the internet. And by default, it uses UDP 4980 to establish a virtual path between the different Citrix SD-WAN instances. Now, after that is done, we are going to create a route. And we are going to tell that if we want to reach our POC environment, we are going to say use the LAN network, and if it's within the POC range of 10.10, you have to use a next hop of IP address, and the IP address will be the SD-WAN LAN interface IP address. So click create. And now that we have created the route, the last thing that we are going to do is create the peering between the different networks. So we are going to create a connection, give it a name, and Azure will do it automatically on both sides of the networks. And here you have to do it yourself. So we first have to set up from the SD-WAN LAN to the servers. And after that, we need to create one from the VPC servers to the SD-WAN LAN. So we'll do that next. So this is the other way around. And we are going to say that we are going to import and export all the different routes so that we don't need to do any manual labor to get that up and running. And after this is finished, if peering is successful, we should see a status of active. And there it is. And that's all there is to it for setting up a Citrix SD-WAN VPX within the Google Cloud. So next up, we are going to prepare our configuration in the Citrix Cloud Orchestrator. So we'll start off by first logging into our Cloud Orchestrator using multi-factor authentication. And after we are logged in, we are going to select our customer. And now we are all set to go to create our first site. In this case, we are going to first create our POC, which will be our master control node. So we give it a name and a location. We are going to select the device model and the role, in this case, the master control node role. And we are going to put in the serial number of the Citrix SD-WAN running in the POC environment. And we start off by configuring our interfaces. So first off, we are going with our LAN interface. And in the POC, the SD-WAN is connected to the network via a trunk. So we fill in our VLAN ID and an IP address. And we are going to do the same for our WAN, but this time we are going to set security to untrusted. We are going to give it the proper VLAN ID and the IP address. And next up, we are going to configure our WAN link. So we are going to select the name of the ISP. And because it's an MCN, we have to put in the public IPv4 address. As for MCN nodes, that is mandatory. And we are going to say the gateway for internet. Done. And next, we're gonna tell which networks can be reached through this Citrix SD-WAN, in this case, the POC network, and the gateway that it will be using to reach that network. And that's all there is to it for setting up the master control node. So next, we are going to create the Azure one. So we give it a name, a location, and we are going to select the device model, this time as a VPX, and the bandwidth tier. We put in the serial number, and we are going to configure the interface. Now, no matter which cloud you are provisioning Citrix SD-WAN to, always number one will always be your LAN interface, and number two will always be your WAN interface. So we put in the IP address, and now we are going to add the WAN interface. So again, giving it the IP. And say it's untrusted. And next we are going to configure the WAN link. So we give the ISP a name, and in this case we are going to say that the public IPv4 can be auto detected, as this is a branch. Next we are going to configure the routing. So we're going to say that the 10.200 IP range is within the Azure. And that's it for configuring our configuration for Citrix SD-WAN in Azure. So we can see the POC already has cloud connectivity, so that's great. So we'll move on for configuring our Google instance. And again, we are going to select a model type of VPX. Put in our serial number. And we are going to configure again our different interfaces. So that's the LAN done. Moving on to the WAN interface. And we are now going to configure the WAN. Giving the ISP a name and auto detect our public IPv4. Selecting our WAN interface to access the WAN. And finally, we are going to define the IP address range that's living behind this Citrix SD-WAN VPX. And that's the Google configuration done. So now that we have created all the different configurations for all the different Citrix SD-WAN instances, we can now deploy it. Now, as you can see, our software version is higher than originally we have deployed our Azure and Google instances. So during staging, what it will do, it will start to download the firmware. It will get the configuration package. So the first time it will always take a little bit longer, the deployment for new instances than for existing instances. And we are going to activate. And what this will do is that all the instances, they will, when they have a new firmware, install the firmware, reboot, and finally they are going to activate the deployment package or configuration package that we have just created in here. It will be activated on the instances. So as we can see already, one instance is already upgraded, done, and has an active configuration. And that's the second one. And that's number 3. So we have now created our virtual path networks among all the different Citrix SD-WAN nodes. And as you can see, everything is up and running and connected. Now, for our POC environment, we don't want to adjust manual routing. So we are going to do it in a more dynamical way. So we are going to create an OSPF establishment between the on-premises router and our Citrix SD-WAN. So we give it a router ID and we are going to advertise our Citrix SD-WAN routes. And we are going to define our OSPF area and interface. And this will make sure that all the routes from Citrix SD-WAN will automatically be learned by the router in the POC environment. Next up, we are going to establish a virtual path between Azure and Google. So we are going to select Google as our remote site. And after that is done, we are going to push out the new configuration package. So first we're going to stage the appliances. And this will go quite quick as all the members have already received the firmware. So staging is done. And now we can activate our new configuration. That's done. So everything is up and running. So now we should be able to go from our POC environment into our Azure resource. So let's try that. There it is. So from the POC to Azure over our virtual path is working. Now let's see if we can reach a resource from Azure into our POC environment. So this is the local gateway in our POC. It's working. So let's see if we can also reach something from Azure over the virtual path in Google. So let's see, and that's also working. So that's all up and running. And next up, we are going to see if we can go from our POC environment into Google. And as you can see, we can start our remote session to our desktop hosted in the Google Cloud. So all in all, really easy to set up, really quick, really handy. So there are a few points to consider when going to deploy your Citrix SD-WAN into cloud. The first being that you should deploy a master control node where you have the most traffic, and that's mostly because getting data out of the cloud, you have to pay for it. So always put your MCN where the most amount of traffic is being generated in and out. Secondly, you can create virtual paths are automatically created between branches and the master control node, but not between branches. And you can either create one manually, as we have just done, or dynamically, which means that the virtual path between a branch will automatically be created at the moment that traffic is being seen by the Citrix SD-WAN instance heading for a different branch. So it will automatically create that. Also, you have to keep in mind with Google and AWS that you have to manually define your firewall rules. And lastly, you have to keep in mind all the different ways how you can route traffic in between clouds and in between the different VNets, VPCs, etc. So you have to keep that in mind, setting this up.
So after the build, let's jump into some deployment methods. We have 3 methods and each has its own up and downs. So we're talking about the first method, that is edge mode, where your Citrix SD-WAN acts as a router where your internet and your MPLS are connected to, and the virtual path is brought up, and the upside of this deployment method is that you're able to consolidate your hardware on your branch. So that's a big win for this deployment type. Another thing to note that this is the only available mode if you're deploying it in the cloud. Next up is your inline mode, where your Citrix SD-WAN is behind your router, still connected to your internet and MPLS connection. It is transparent behind your router, so no need to change route. The SD-WAN picks up the traffic flowing through the box and makes the right decision on which connection to use. So that could depend on how busy one line is or the other line is, or other details. This inline mode has a special feature called fail to wire, and we'll be talking about that later on in this presentation. First off, let's talk about the last mode of deployment, that is virtual inline. And first off, let's state that in this case you need a routing protocol, and please use your routing protocol that you're comfortable with. So OSPF, PBR, BGP, or static, use the one you like. In this case, if there's traffic that needs to be sent down the virtual path or down your other branches, it is routed to your Citrix SD-WAN dynamically, and after that it's sent down the virtual path, consisting of, in this case, internet and MPLS connections. And next up is the little gem called fail to wire, which we talked about earlier. And it is because in the case of inline mode, as we stated, traffic flows through the SD-WAN transparent through the data plane. And in the case of a power failure, or if, even worse, if your Citrix SD-WAN breaks, which we haven't seen earlier in our experiences and proof of concepts and builds, fail to wire acts, and that means that a physical relay shuts down, and basically makes your Citrix SD-WAN one expensive cable. So data, because of the transparency, data still flows through your router towards your safe connection. We have to define what connection is safe and what connection isn't safe, but our MPLS is safe. So data still flows through your MPLS down your path. And in this case, our internet line is shut down because it isn't safe. So do note that if failed to wire X, your local breakout is also gone.
So now that we have seen how Citrix SD-WAN helps to get to the cloud really quick, fast, in setting it up, but also providing a really resilient, flexible, and high quality way, we can also do some more stuff with using Citrix SD-WAN and cloud together. If you look at, for example, if you have branches spread out across the world, normally what would happen if they need to communicate to one another is that every branch would get a local ISP that would give them an MPLS connection, and that will be terminated into a global peering partner. And that way, all the different branches across the world can communicate with one another and with your data center. Now, if we are using Citrix SD-WAN and we are deploying it within our cloud providers, the other thing we can do, instead of using global peering partners, we can also use the cloud backbone to transfer all the data from all the different regions, continents to one another. And the great thing about this is that it will, the cloud backbone is high speed, and you only have to pay for the data that you're really using in and out of different regions, compared to the old model where you also have to pay your fixed fee, etc., etc. So by leveraging this, we can create a really resilient path from our branch to the nearest cloud provider where we have deployed our Citrix SD-WAN appliance, apply quality of service, and then using the cloud backbone going to one of our other branches or data center located in a different continent. Now, if you are using this, then you have to keep in mind that not all clouds are equal, meaning that they all have different opinions on whether or not you can use the backbone, in which amount you can use the backbone, and how they are routing in between different regions. So you have to keep that in mind. Also, the geographical spread of the different cloud providers you have to keep in mind, because they're not always present at the same locations. And the last thing you have to keep in mind is performance, because depending on which cloud service you are using, there's a difference in the performance you are getting traveling from and to different continents. And that can range from just a few milliseconds up to 15, 20 milliseconds compared to the different cloud providers. So if you want to use this, you have to keep in mind that you have to check which cloud is best performing for transferring data in between different continents.
So the final chapter, all about the users. In these COVID days, we're using a lot of video conferencing, GoToMeeting, Zoom, and Teams. And in the case of Teams, if we're chatting one-to-one, the media, the interactive connectivity establishment protocol by Microsoft flows freely to one user to another. In the case of a firewall, this traffic flows through Azure. The chat service is secure and always goes to Azure. In the case of a Teams meeting with multiple participants, the media, so the audio and video, always flows through Azure. As we all can imagine, this is a big impact on your expensive MPLS lines if you're backhauling this traffic towards your data center and then towards the cloud. So in this case, a local breakout functionality would be perfect to dump this traffic immediately towards Azure. And to get some facts and figures, we've tested this local breakout functionality versus your backhaul. And to give you an example, the backhaul through the data center. It looks like this. So your branch office on the left sends your traffic down the virtual path, in our case, because we've built this with Citrix SD-WAN, towards your data center and then towards the cloud. Not all backhauls are done through SD-WAN or through a virtual path, but in the case of our investigation with Go-EUC, we did it with a virtual path. So do note that this is an optimized path towards our data center. The other way,
we also already stripped all the delaying components, like any firewalls or proxy servers. We stripped them out. So this is really the best way if you're backhauling, the most optimum way to do it.
Yes. So in our case, in our investigation with Go-EUC, we researched our backhaul with the local breakout. And the local breakout means that traffic towards Azure is sent out directly through our internet line. And I can hear you think, but hey, those internet lines and the virtual path isn't the same. It isn't, but we both kept them on 11 megabytes per second. So that is the same. And what we did to compare those two methods is we've downloaded within OneDrive, we've uploaded files into OneDrive and we've downloaded them 10 times, each file size 10 times. And we've compared the backhaul versus the local breakout. And after our research, we've got the following facts and figures. It almost meant 15% less download time for each file size. And we had a slight difference with the one megabyte file that we couldn't explain directly, but it changes from time to time. But overall, I think a great performance win with the local breakout, and with the one gigabyte files. That means a lot of saved time for the end user. But if Ruud wants to explain the following round trip time.
Yeah, so we also take a look at how long it would take for sending a packet from the client and getting a response back to the client. And there we saw a decrease in round trip time of 80%. And that's highly noticeable for a user for using applications that are interactive, as this will make it either make it really smooth or it makes it really laggy. So this is a really big improvement.
So the local breakout makes your interactiveness more smooth versus the backhaul that makes it laggy. Okay, now these are some real facts and figures. So yeah, this is why we do this. Well, to end our presentation, I think this quote suits it perfect. We cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them, by Albert. Yeah, perhaps Ruud has something to add.
Yeah, so moving forwards to the cloud, we have to rethink our implementation and strategy that we are using for connecting all our different resources together, because the old way isn't cutting it anymore. So we really need something new, in this case, Citrix SD-WAN, for getting seamlessly and good performance to the cloud.
To end this presentation, we would like to thank you. There's a Citrix Convert Slack. If you have any questions, need help, want to build it yourself, contact us on Twitter or on the Slack channel. We hope you enjoyed it, and let's go build.